And to maintain homeostasis, for them to be able to regulate and maintain internal conditions, um, cells, tissues, and organs all have to be able to communicate with one another. And plants and animals both rely heavily on endocrine communication, that is, the production and release of chemicals. Animals, in addition, also rely on nervous communication, and that's electrical communication. Now, what's interesting is that, of course, nervous communication does also rely on some chemical neurotransmitters, but that's a very close proximity, so it can still happen very quickly. Endocrine communication, on the other hand, refers to a wider spread, release, and transmission of chemicals through the body. So, as you can imagine, that makes endocrine communication a little bit slower, taking place on the order of minutes to hours to days, even weeks, months, and years. And so, an example would be a salmon preparing for spawning is going to undergo some remarkable changes as it moves from saltwater to freshwater, and those changes are controlled by hormones, by endocrine communication. Now, for an animal that needs to respond much more quickly to a stimulus, like this flatfish, for example, that is changing its color patterns in response to the substrate, that's going to require nervous communication because that electrical communication can happen much more quickly. Now, today we're going to be focusing on endocrine communication in animals in preparation for the activity that we're going to do in class on Monday. We're going to be talking about plants a little bit later in the week, and you're going to be doing a really cool lab on plant hormones. So the endocrine system in animals relies on chemical communication, like we just talked about. And that is really what we're talking about as the production, release, and reception of hormones. So we've got these little substances, these chemicals called hormones that are being produced in the body, released, and then received somewhere else in the body. And the effects of that communication really result from what are the tissues targeted. So different tissues are going to receive different hormones, and the amount of hormone that's both produced and received. And it's important to note that received because, of course, hormone supplements can influence the behavior of target tissues, which is why they're popular with cheating athletes, for example. Okay, so when we talk about hormones, we're talking about chemicals. And those chemicals are usually secreted into bodily fluids, what are called interstitial fluids in your book. Interstitial just means the spaces in between. So hormones are chemicals that are secreted into fluids. They can be produced by individual cells. For example, your fat cells produce hormones. They can be produced by clusters of cells. We see that in the digestive tract, for example. But we're most familiar with the production of hormones by specialized organs known as glands. And glands, as you may recall from an earlier discussion, are primarily composed of epithelial tissue. And oftentimes those tissues are specialized to produce these specific chemical hormones. Now, a word about glands, there's really two sort of types or functions of glands. You can have what are called exocrine glands, and these are glands that release materials through a duct. Good examples would be sweat glands or tear glands, right? Lacrimal glands that produce tears, and then those tears are released through a duct in your eye. Mammary glands that are used to feed young mammals with milk are another example. Endocrine glands are glands that produce chemical hormones across the gland, and those glands, rather than being carried through a duct or tube, are simply secreted directly into the fluids. The pancreas provides a really interesting example because it behaves in both an exocrine and an endocrine fashion. Here we have this little green tube, the common bile duct that is connected to by the pancreatic duct, and those ducts release digestive fluids into the digestive tract. The pancreas also functions as an endocrine gland because here all over the pancreas are what are known as islet cells that produce the hormones insulin and glucagon that influence blood sugar. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. For today, we're going to be primarily focusing on the function of endocrine glands, but exocrine glands do play very significant roles in our body, and we're going to find out more about them. As you can imagine, hormone function is very closely regulated by the body. And there's really three major types of hormones that we find in animal bodies. There's amino acid-based hormones, which are basically one or two amino acids. Remember, amino acids are the building blocks that we use to make up proteins. So each protein is basically a chain of amino acids. So one or two amino acids that's one type of hormone. Peptide-based hormones are longer protein-based hormones. And both amino acid and peptide-based hormones can be relatively short-lived, and they tend to be received by target receptors on the outside of target cells. Steroid hormones, on the other hand, are cholesterol-based. So these are lipid or fatty-based hormones. They tend to be a little more persistent in the body. They can stay around longer. And they are actually received and acted on by receptors inside the cells. So depending on the type of hormone, that can influence what happens in the body. Feedback loops, of course, are also going to be really important. And we see both negative and positive feedback controlled by hormones. In lab next week, in lab this week, you are actually going to be looking at a negative feedback loop that's hormone-based. And that's the feedback loop that involves the pancreas releasing insulin in response to too much glucose in the body, or releasing glucagon in response to too little glucose in the body. And because the amount of blood sugar can have a really big impact on homeostasis to the point that if it's too low, you die, you can imagine this is a very closely controlled negative feedback loop. And you're going to find out more about that in lab on Thursday and Friday. Positive feedback is also connected to hormones. And we mentioned the idea of labor and childbirth when we talked about feedback loops. And this is just sort of a refresher on that as the baby's head pushes down on the cervix, those stretch receptors signal the hypothalamus to release a hormone called oxytocin. And that's released through the posterior pituitary, which is actually an extension of the hypothalamus. And so what happens is you've got a hormone that's actually released from up near the base of the brain that has to travel through the bloodstream down to the uterus. So you can have these fairly distant responses by hormones. Now, I mentioned this idea of the hypothalamus when I talked about the childbirth feedback loop. And you might be wondering, what's the hypothalamus? So the hypothalamus is really cool. Much of the endocrine function in our bodies is controlled by this so-called master gland, which is actually a cluster of what are known as neurosecretory cells. In other words, nerve cells that secrete chemicals at the base of the brain. Okay. So the hypothalamus is actually part of the brain, although we refer to it as the master gland, and it's got a huge impact on endocrine communication. So this cluster of cells in turn impacts the pituitary gland, which you may have heard of in high school health when they separate out the boys and the girls, and you have your little sex ed class and you learn about how your pituitary is ruining your life. So we're going to find out a little bit more about the pituitary today, and that it's not actually ruining our life. It controls a lot of things. What's really neat about the pituitary is it's divided into two parts. The anterior pituitary is a separate gland, and you can see it is sort of highlighted here in pink in the diagram from your book. And this anterior pituitary is directly controlled by the hypothalamus. You'll notice these green nerve cells that are attached to the anterior pituitary. So the hypothalamus controls the anterior pituitary by releasing chemicals that in turn affect what the pituitary does. What's known as the posterior pituitary is actually an extension of the hypothalamus. And so what we see with the posterior pituitary is it's a way for the hypothalamus itself to release endocrine hormones. And the posterior pituitary releases a couple of hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus. Antidiuretic hormone, also known as ADH, is a hormone that has a big influence in basically water balance in the body. And when ADH is released by the hypothalamus, that influences the activity of the kidneys and causes them to either retain water if you have a lot of ADH, or to not retain water if ADH levels are low. Oxytocin is a very important hormone produced in the hypothalamus. And oxytocin, as I already briefly mentioned, if we go back to the labor and childbirth loop, oxytocin is a very important hormone in the positive feedback loop that leads to labor and delivery. Oxytocin is also very important in nursing mammals in what's known as the milk letdown reflex. In other words, a sucking baby is going to cause the mother's hypothalamus to release oxytocin, which is then going to allow milk to be released by the mammary glands. Now, what's really interesting about oxytocin is we've seen it's released during labor and it's released during nursing, and oxytocin is strongly associated with pair bonding. In other words, the formation of strong bonds. It has a big effect on the brain and affects bonding, especially between mothers and their offspring, which would certainly explain why we're willing to tolerate their lack of sleep and crazy behavior. Oxytocin is also released by humans during the orgasm response, and so it's connected to pair bonding, not just between parents and offspring, but also between mates. So that's a really interesting function of oxytocin as well. So it's a very, very important human hormone in helping to maintain our family function and structure and things like that. The anterior pituitary, remember, is, if I go back, a separate gland that, unlike the posterior pituitary, which is an extension of the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary is controlled by the hypothalamus. And the anterior pituitary, in turn, controls many, many, many other glands in the body, and other tissues and organs as well. And what we're going to see, if you look at, there's table 4.2 in your book, it has a nice overview, and we're going to be using it for our activity on Monday, a nice overview of many of the hormones produced throughout the body and whether they're under the control of the anterior pituitary or not. And what you'll see is a lot of them are. Two hormones produced by the anterior pituitary are called luteinizing hormone, LH, and follicle stimulating hormone, FSH. And those two hormones act directly on the gonads. If you're a female, those are your ovaries. If you're male, those are your testes. And both of those hormones stimulate the gonads to do things like produce sperm or eggs, and also to produce sex hormones. So here's a really interesting case where we have one hormone that's being produced by the pituitary, actually two hormones, and then their influence on additional glands, the ovaries and testes, to produce new hormones. In the case of the ovaries, those sex hormones are estrogen and progesterone, also known as the female sex hormones. And in males, the testes produce androgens, including testosterone. Testosterone, of course, being known as the male sex hormone. And these hormones are associated with secondary sexual characteristics, breast development and the onset of menstruation, those kinds of things in females. In males, testosterone, of course, is going to be connected to the development of facial hair, also muscle development and bulking up, and of course, testosterone has a well-known impact on aggression. That's why there's a picture of a bull shark here. Bull sharks are a well-known aggressive species of shark who also happen to have extremely high levels of testosterone, and those two have been linked. Of course, as we mentioned before, testosterone also is connected, and other androgens are connected to this idea of muscle building, which is why we hear about androgens being used quite a bit by baseball players to build their muscles. Now, this brings us to a really interesting environmental problem, and that's the impacts of what are known as estrogen mimics. Sometimes you'll also hear them called endocrine mimics or hormone mimics. And some of you may have heard of something called BPA, also known as bisphenol A. And BPA is really interesting because it's an estrogen mimic. And the concern, the reason why so many people want to get BPA-free drinking bottles and baby bottles that are free of BPA is that high levels of estrogen are associated with a lot of negative impacts, including early onset of puberty, girls, for example, developing as early as 8 or 9, starting to get breast development and things like that. Development of female secondary sex characteristics in boys. So you have boys showing breast development if they're exposed to high levels of estrogen. Estrogen is also associated with reproductive cancers in both males and females. High levels of estrogen in particular are associated with breast cancer, which of course males and females both can get. And obesity, and this is sort of an interesting feedback loop because fat cells also produce a little bit of estrogen. And so oftentimes if you have someone who is obese, they may be producing high levels of estrogen. That may also be contributing to obesity. Little girls who are very heavy set may have early puberty, not because they've been exposed to BPA, but because they are obese. And so these are real challenges and health issues that have led to many states limiting or banning BPA, including Oregon. Now, the good news is research has demonstrated that for most people, the environmental levels and accumulation in human tissues of BPA is a lot lower than that associated with cancers in laboratory rodents. So that's good news. But especially early in development, it's important to limit the exposure to these kinds of chemicals, which is why for little babies especially, keeping BPA out of bottles and stuff is important. So that is a sort of an interesting side note. Like we mentioned, the influence of hormones is connected to not just the amount produced, but the amount received. And here's an external source of a chemical that mimics a hormone and can have an impact on the body. Okay, so we know that the anterior pituitary controls gonads. It also controls the development of the mammary glands through the production of prolactin. And prolactin is going to stimulate development of mammary glands during pregnancy, so mothers after their children are born are prepared, at least in mammals of course, are prepared to feed the babies with milk. Growth hormone is a very interesting hormone produced by the pituitary because what growth hormone does is it affects just about every single tissue in the body. And so both the gonad hormones, estrogen and testosterone, as well as growth hormone are associated with the wonderful time of life known as puberty. And they do stimulate quite a bit of growth, increasing protein synthesis, increasing cellular metabolism, and stimulating growth. And growth hormone, of course, is well known for its effects on humans. Too little growth hormone, as seen in this photograph, can retard growth or hinder growth. Too Too much growth hormone, as seen in this photograph, can overstimulate growth. So you've got people who are outside the norm for how short or how tall they are based on growth hormone. The good news is this growth hormone is now, for at least people who don't produce enough, growth hormone is something that can be synthetically developed and administered. Okay. That's not all that the pituitary does, though. It also controls the thyroid and the adrenal glands. So thyroid stimulating hormone is produced by the anterior pituitary to stimulate the thyroid, which is a gland found sort of at the base of the throat. And the thyroid produces a hormone known as thyroxine, and thyroxine controls metabolism. And this is why, for example, people are concerned about their amount of thyroid hormone. There's a well-known condition known as goiter, which is shown in the photograph here, which has to do with overactivity of the thyroid. Thyroid hormone, thyroxine, is a iodine-based hormone. And so people with low iodine levels develop a feedback loop in which the thyroid gland grows really, really, really large to try to produce more hormone because they don't have a lot of iodine. Now, this can be really, really easily controlled, and it's part of the reason why we have iodine in our salt now. But you still see this condition sometimes in areas of Appalachia or areas where people are really, really poor and just very much getting low nutrition. Now, as I mentioned, thyroid hormone, thyroxine, controls metabolism. This has been probably best publicized by Oprah, who has claimed that she has low thyroid function. And people with low thyroid function, they don't produce enough thyroxine. Their metabolisms are very low. They tend to be tired, sometimes depressed. They feel sluggish a lot of the time because they're just not producing enough of that hormone that ramps up their metabolism. Now, some people have an overactive thyroid that produces too much thyroxine. Those people tend to have a very high metabolism. It can be hard for them to gain weight. They may have a hard time sleeping and suffer from insomnia, and they tend to be cold a lot of the time too sometimes. So thyroid function can be really important. Another thyroid hormones are also important in the release of calcium and the uptake of calcium from the bones. So thyroid controls both metabolism and calcium function. Another hormone released by the anterior pituitary is adrenocorticotropic hormone, and that is going to stimulate the adrenal glands, which are found right here on the tops of the kidneys. And there's two parts to the adrenal gland. The adrenal cortex, which is the outside part. The adrenal cortex, what that's going to do, that stimulates or produces a lot of hormones that also help regulate metabolism, including something called cortisol, which you may have seen on television commercials, that is released under stressful conditions. And it is going to help also regulate metabolism by influencing glucose uptake and fat burning. Under stressful conditions, a lot of cortisol is released, and that's going to lower glucose use and raise the burning of fat for energy. The other thing that's kind of interesting is small amounts of testosterone are also produced by the adrenal cortex. And that makes sense because the adrenal glands do play a big role in the stress response. Testosterone is connected to some kinds of aggressive behavior, so they may be helpful. What's fascinating is in some cases, you can have overproduction of testosterone by the adrenal glands, which has been documented to lead to, for example, the growth of a lot of facial hair in women because their ovaries are functioning perfectly normal. They've got plenty of estrogen, but they've got adrenal glands that are way overproducing testosterone. And so they get this facial hair. It's the so-called bearded lady phenomenon. The adrenal medulla, which is the center part of the adrenal gland, is really important in what's called the fight or flight response. It secretes two hormones known as epinephrine and norepinephrine, and those hormones are going to help prepare the body for fight or flight, doing things like raising the heart rate, dilating blood vessels, those kinds of things, slowing down digestion. They're going to prepare the body to deal with stress. So the anterior pituitary is hugely important in controlling many other parts of the body, but it is not the only important gland. The pancreas, as we mentioned, has both an exocrine and an endocrine function. We are interested in the endocrine function, and that endocrine function of the pancreas is primarily connected to blood glucose levels. It's a negative feedback loop focusing on blood glucose levels. And so what we see is that if there's a lot of sugar in the blood, a lot of glucose in the blood, and remember, glucose is a quick energy source. It's a good thing to have, but you don't need too much of it. If there's more in the blood than the body can use, then the pancreas is going to release a chemical, a hormone called insulin. And that insulin is going to stimulate primarily liver activity. And what the liver will be doing is, at that point, converting glucose to a long-term storage form called glycogen. Now, over time, of course, blood sugar may drop. And when that happens, there's another hormone, a complementary hormone released from the pancreas, known as glucagon. If blood sugar is too low, glucagon is also going to act on the liver, and the liver is going to take that glycogen that it stored earlier, and it's going to break that glycogen down into glucose. And so this negative feedback loop is going to make sure that blood sugar is always maintained at the appropriate level. And what we're going to see in lab next week is what happens, this week is what happens when that feedback loop doesn't work properly. Okay. Now, there's a variety of other hormones produced in other locations. Again, these are outlined also in table 4.2 of your book. The pineal gland produces melatonin. That influences sleep cycles. Melatonin is actually a supplement you can take if you have insomnia. It may help you sleep. And the pineal gland is just located in the brain. The thymus, which is located in the chest, stimulates the production of T cells, immune cells, that are going to help with the immune response. What's interesting about the thymus is it is particularly large in young children who presumably are still building their immune systems. It gets much smaller in older adults, and very old people have a very small thymus. The kidneys are involved in several responses. One thing that's really important is that they release a hormone that, when oxygen is too low, will stimulate the red blood cell production by the bone marrow. So kidneys have a big role in making sure that you have the right number of red blood cells that carry oxygen. They also can produce hormones that influence blood pressure. So the kidneys are very sensitive to blood pressure, and if it's too high or too low, they can release hormones that are going to impact that. The heart even releases a few hormones in response to blood volume. If blood volume becomes too high, for example, maybe there's too much water in the blood, the heart will influence the kidneys to release water and lower the blood volume. The digestive tract releases a huge variety of hormones that regulate things like digestion, what enzymes are produced. It regulates the movement of food through the digestive tract, and even things like how full you feel. That's controlled by hormones. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, fat cells are known to produce hormones. They produce a hormone called leptin. And this is a really interesting one because leptin influences appetite and how full you feel. And the hypothesis is that with more fat cells, hypothetically, more leptin should be produced, thus reducing appetite as in a feedback loop. What's been found in both rodents and humans is that some organisms are leptin deficient, they don't produce enough leptin, or they lack the receptors that receive leptin. And when this happens, for example, here's a normal mouse and here's a leptin deficient mouse, the organism doesn't have that natural check on appetite and often overeat excessively. So that is a really interesting impact. So in conjunction with reading the book chapter for Monday and this presentation, we're going to use this information to do an activity and look at how hormones work together to help the body maintain homeostasis. So I will look forward to seeing you on Monday to do that activity.